Going to be talking all things Velvet Underground with Dylan Jones after this.
Standing on the corner.
Sweet Jane by the Velvet Underground. Loaded, the life and afterlife of the Velvet Underground is Dylan Jones' definitive oral history of the Velvet Underground, drawing on contributions from remaining members, musicians, critics, filmmakers, and a generation of artists who emerged in their wake. Delighted to be joining me live on the line, author of Loaded, Dylan Jones himself. Dylan, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon to you. How are you doing?
I'm very well. You know, another day in Spain. It could be worse, I suppose. It's funny though.
Lovely.
Here we are in sunny Spain. Of course, Nico had a great relationship with Spain. In fact, she passed away in Spain a couple of decades ago. But if we're talking sunny and peace and love and whatever, that was definitely not what the Velvets were about, were they?
They were kind of the opposite of that, and they were the first pop group to actually invert the whole process by appearing odd and weird, dressing in black, wearing sunglasses, and having no interest really engaging with their audience. I mean, it sounds kind of crazy, but it became a pop archetype.
And if you think about it at the time, pop bands were supposed to be approachable, the sort of people you take home to meet your mom. I mean, if you think about the Beach Boys singing "We Could Get Married," well, you certainly wouldn't want to get married to the Underground, would you?
It's weird because it was, on the one hand, it was a collection, it was a kind of motley crew of outsiders, and yet the brand that they came up with is something that has lasted now for over 60 years.
I mean, what's the original sort of the original spark, the chispa, if you will, that brings everybody together? Is it Lou Reed? I mean, how do they all come together? I mean, because we kind of get this idea and we associate them really strongly with 60s New York and Warhol and the Factory, and they're very much a New York band. But how do they all sort of glue together?
Well, Lou Reed, when he left college, became the staff writer of a kind of hokey, small kind of publishers, and they were making gimmick records. And then one of these gimmick records took off, and it was called The Ostrich, and they had to appear on a television show. And so they kind of put this group of people together, one of whom was Lou Reed, one of whom was John Cale. That sparked a relationship, and they decided that they actually wanted to make proper music together. So, like a lot of things, it was serendipity.
But rather than sort of doing the 3-minute pop songs, I mean, it's an art collective, isn't it? They take it very, very seriously. The lyrics are dealing with subjects that, your average band wasn't singing about at the time. I mean, they might have been a bit psychedelic, but they certainly weren't singing about sort of heroin and prostitution. And also, I hadn't really thought about this, but they are sort of this mixed gender lineup in a way that isn't the Mamas and the Papas.
Yeah, you're completely right. And I think unlike all the people who came in their wake, they were genuinely subversive, and they were genuinely transgressive, and they were interested in the darker side of life. They were interested in making the kind of music that wasn't on the radio. They were interested in exploring themes that weren't, as you say, normally explored by pop music. And then, of course, another happy accident, Andy Warhol goes to see them play one night in Greenwich Village and decides that he wants to include them as his part of his sort of his crazy bunch of factory cohorts, and they became famous almost overnight.
Yeah, it's interesting with the Factory, though, because Warhol can be a bit of a monster, and it's sort of, he spits out, and there are casualties. I'm thinking, obviously, Little Joe who gets sung about later in Walking the Wild Side. But is it Edie or Eddie Sedgwick, who, the first...
Edie,
yeah, Edie, the first superstar. And it's a very... It says something about the Velvet Underground that they, if you like, they survive the Factory and become, they are linked with it, but they are bigger than it, rather than other people.
Yeah, as you say, Warhol had a history, or developed a kind of a habit of embracing people and then discarding them when he bumped into someone more interesting. But actually, it was the Velvet Underground who got rid of Warhol, because even though they were playing quite odd music, not traditional pop music, they did actually want to be successful. And even though Warhol was very good at getting them a lot of attention initially, he wasn't actually a very good manager and wasn't particularly adept at steering their career. So they decided to go off and explore more orthodox forms of management, leaving the factory behind.
So who was kind of getting this music? Because as we said, I mean, there's some rock and roll, Sweet Jane, which I play, but some stuff is challenging, and they could just be another sort of New York art house band who sort of submerged themselves by sort of 71, 72. So who was kind of buying the stuff? Who was actually getting what they were trying to do? And did people get it in the States and in Europe? Was it purely who were attracted, if you like, to the music?
Well, it was a very small number of people. Even though they became famous, they weren't selling records in vast numbers because they were quite off-putting. However, there's a famous saying, which I repeat in the book, which is that the Velvet Underground weren't listened to by very many people, but every person who did listen to them went off and formed a band.
Well, because if they can do it, then we can do it. And he didn't. I suppose this is at a time when psychedelic music is going to turn into prog rock, and they've all come out of that folk music background before, and so all the mainstream bands are getting more and more perhaps a little bit pompous, and yet the Velvet Underground, they are pre-punk punks, aren't they? Down to the look. I mean, the Ramones, etc., have stolen that look, as did sort of Sid, as did Vicious and the Pistols.
Everybody copied that look. It all goes back to the Velvet Underground: the leather jackets, skinny black jeans, the pointed shoes, a striped T-shirt, sunglasses, spiky hair. And actually, if you study the fashion, John Cale, the Velvet Underground's viola and keyboard player, he wore a lock around his neck, like many punks copied 10 years later. And also, there are photographs of Lou Reed and Andy Warhol with safety pins through their clothes. And this is at least 12 or 13 years before the punk. So in all respects, they are influential.
It's interesting as well, though, because you've got to have a certain amount of intelligence to appreciate, but also to take the good things. I mean, obviously, Barry becomes good friends, produces stuff with Lou Reed at a later date, Iggy, etc. as well. But if you get it wrong and you don't get the intelligence, you end up end up overdosing in the Chelsea hotel, don't you?
Yeah, I think that for Lou Reed, he was smart and he used his image as a way to propel himself professionally, and his image became a version of himself, whereas there were other people who in the band and other people who around the Velvet Underground for whom they didn't have the foresight or indeed the intelligence to actually amplify their brand, and they became casualties, like you say. But Lou Reed was smart because he burnished that image and the image became much bigger than him.
So when it comes to writing about the Velvet Underground, is it a bit of a sacred cow? I mean, I know you've written about Elvis because we spoke about that before, and that's the sacred cow of all sacred cows. But Elvis, everybody knows, everybody's got an opinion about him. But the Velvet Underground is even more. It's like you can't touch that. It's the underground Nirvana, isn't it?
It is, but I always think that the interesting part of anyone's life, and I remember when we spoke about Elvis, I said the same thing. It's the parts that aren't mediated, the parts that aren't written about. And so the whole point of the book was speaking to lots of people who were involved with the Velvet Underground and Lou Reed and Nico, and as they were pursuing their solo careers, people who were involved with them who weren't necessarily front and center. Because I always think that there are lots of people who famous people interact with who don't often get the opportunity to tell their stories. So if you're talking to other journalists and photographers and filmmakers and makeup artists and club people, and people that others might call marginal, their impressions of these famous people are often as important, sometimes more important, than the musicians that they surround themselves with.
Yeah, and if you think about it, those struggling journalists, rock writers, photographers, editors, those are the people in a pre-social media age, a pre-YouTube age, kids ask your parents, who got the message out there. I mean, if they were being written about in a Greenwich magazine, great, but the waves had to start somewhere. And if it wasn't for, the guys who said, yeah, this lot looks interesting, let's run a story on them, then they wouldn't have got out there. And from that ripple, thousands, stroke millions of lives are changed.
Well, most of the books that I've done have been about the 1970s or later. And this was something different for me because I was interviewing a lot of people who were in their 70s and 80s. So I wouldn't say there was a rush to get them before they died, but there were certainly at least 30 people that I interviewed that perhaps if I go back in a couple of years' time won't be around. I mean, Seymour Stein, who started Sire Records and famously signed Madonna and the Ramones and many New York acts, I actually did the last interview with him for this book. And there are lots of people who knew Warhol, who were around in the early 60s, who have very good recollections. But as I say, in a few years' time, they will have moved on.
But the interesting thing is, those guys then, they create the New York, which then creates whilst everybody else is being West Coast and happy surfer music, which then creates the atmosphere, the melting pot that you can have CBGBs, which means you can have Talking Heads, which means you can have television, Blondie, and the Ramones, and that sparks the whole new wave, which is where we come in.
It's so true. Everything goes back to the Velvet Underground.
So what do you hope that people will learn from this then, Dylan? And what bit made you sort of go, because I know you've written about, a few things before in your history, but what made you think, Blimey O'Reilly or words to that effect about what you discovered? Perhaps, I don't know, Lou Reed's penchant for practical jokes or something like that, perhaps.
I mean, Lou Reed is a really interesting case in point because I got to know him towards the end of his life, and I think that he'd built up such a good sort of persona that people were scared of Lou Reed because they thought that he was an ogre, they thought that he was difficult, but actually that was Lou Reed, the persona. And actually, if you got to know Lou Reed, he was a very measured, very cautious, very bright, very world-weary person who used that persona in the same way that any performer would do to not only attract people, but repel them at the same time.
Somebody isn't that into the Velvet Underground and wants. What would you recommend? What would you recommend is Velvet Underground 101 if they want to approach with caution?
I think playing "I'm Waiting for the Man" because I think you and I and other people who are perhaps not teenagers anymore have heard this record forever and ever and ever, and it becomes kind of part of rock furniture. But I think try and listen to that record as though you've never heard it before, and it's an incredible piece of work.
Well, not only that, but it's the sort of thing that anybody who's ever formed a band, that's one of the, I know I did, one of the first things that you learn to play.
Exactly.
The book is called Loaded, The Life and Afterlife of the Velvet Underground. It's out now on White Rabbits? It's out
White Rabbit Books, yeah.
Indeed, it's by Dylan Jones. Dylan, I know you're somewhat busy, so thanks for taking the time, and I hope to speak to you very soon indeed. The book is called Loaded. It's by Dylan Jones. Dylan, thank you so much for your time today.
You're very kind. Have a great day.